All right, so what we're going to talk about today is using a trauma-informed framework to be able to provide us with a bit of a foundation for helping other people as they face challenges and adversity. So first, a little bit of background about myself. I grew up in central Nebraska. Both my parents were raised on farms, but chose off-farm professions themselves. And I was really fortunate to be able to provide highly unskilled but very affordable labor to my grandparents' operation, where they did feed cattle and hogs and chickens and corn and soybeans. So I also wanted to include this picture because I like to illustrate that not all Nebraska is table flat. I lived in Valley County and we actually had hills there. So just like to make sure people have an accurate representation of that. So my background then, I've been a therapist for 20 some years before joining the Colorado Agribility Project. And I also worked for a CSU extension. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But right out of graduate school, I started working at a residential treatment center. The vast majority of my clinical experience has been working with at-risk adolescents. And so that to be effective working with adolescents, you also have to work with the systems around them. So a lot of family work, a lot of work with community stakeholders and schools, and everyone really that has an influence on the sort of circle of relationships amongst adolescents. But started at a residential treatment center out in a mountain valley in New Mexico. It actually used to be a tuberculosis sanitarium, and Doc Holliday was one of the more esteemed patients who went through that back in the day. We had 9 youth per cottage and had 9 cottages, and the average length of stay for this place was about a year. So you can imagine that these are youth with pretty severe emotional and behavioral problems. It was interesting to note that about a third of them were Eastern European adoptees. So back in the early 2000s or so, there was a big sort of increase in adopting young people in their first couple years from Eastern European countries, and very well-intentioned and well-meaning parents did this, but were not prepared for the impact of what happens to the developing brain in those first couple years of life. So you end up with a condition called reactive attachment disorder that makes it really hard for those youth to bond and develop effective social connections with other people. So I'll put that out there because that's a little bit of what sort of formed the very specific focus on working with trauma. I also did some in-home therapy for a number of years where I would meet with families in their homes. And the intent was to try to work with youth that were already involved in the legal system to prevent them from getting further into that system. So we'd actually work with families at their kitchen table to develop rules and consequences, different supervision, different ways of promoting increased warmth, and also some accountability that went with that. Then I was a clinical lead for about 7 years at a juvenile correctional center. That got really hard during COVID, and I came to the realization that I probably paid off my karmic debt for my own adolescence, and it might be time to look for something different, and was able to get this more recent job with Agrability, which allows me to blend my personal roots and values around agriculture with my professional focus. So one of the things I'll say about this juvenile correctional center, I was part of the statewide committee that worked on traveling around to all the different facilities and try to promote a trauma responsive environment. And so a lot of what I'm going to share with you today are things that we worked on and developed to try to give a significant amount of education and understanding to the security staff that worked with youth. We would also share much of this with youth as well, with the idea being that if you can better understand what's going on with you, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, you can shift the question from what's wrong with me to what's happening to me. And particularly when we look at trauma, that's an important distinction. So that's a little bit about my professional background and why I really believe in working on helping people understand what the brain can and can't do in managing crisis situations. And hopefully this will provide at least a little bit of foundation for people to have some sort of compass when working with people that, may be facing some pretty tough situations. It's not meant to be all encompassing, and there'll be an opportunity tomorrow if anyone wants to follow up or has additional questions on application and things like that. But hopefully this provides a bit of a groundwork. So my current position, the 2018 Farm Bill divided the country into 4 regions. You all may be familiar with this. These are farm ranch stress assistance networks. My position is primarily funded through the Western region agricultural stress assistance program, or these green states. So I have the honor and privilege of working with organizations across all those states to really try to focus on reducing farm stress and suicide prevention in our rural and agricultural communities. Most of you are familiar with the nature of farm stress, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into that. If you are going to be forward serving our agricultural producers, you probably have a pretty good indication that agriculture as an occupation faces its own unique set of strengths and stressors. Real quick, to sort of contrast this with that high stress job of working in corrections, even if I was leaving hours past the shift when my shift was supposed to end, I would get to leave every day. And there was a big metal door that slammed shut behind me, creating a visceral separation between that stressful environment I was in and the rest of my world. I had a 30-minute drive to get home, to reset my thinking, to prepare myself to interact with family that were not part of that same stressful environment. My paychecks were the same and came at the same time, regardless of what was going on. And in spite of all the chaos that may have happened in that building, those elements that were consistent and stable helped to be able to weather that a lot longer than I'd be able to if I also had to worry about market impacts or weather or all these other things that our producers face. So I just want to establish kind of a baseline that if we understand occupation as one of those, or sorry, understand agriculture as one of those occupations, that the number of variables that someone has to attend to, plan for, and mitigate in order to be successful, I think it makes it a highly unique occupation. And there are a lot of other high stress occupations such as first responders, military, law enforcement, different things like that, that also have employee assistance programs that allow people to get support, usually free support, by other people that understand the unique challenges of that profession. Agriculture historically hasn't had that. So anything we can do to provide additional layers of empathy and understanding and resources to support our producers, it's hugely important. So I definitely applaud everyone's involvement in this project, and I just feel like that's worth noting. So those green states did a survey a number of years ago. They surveyed just under 800 Western region producers to look at their top stressors. The top 3 they identified were workload, lack of time, and financial worries. So I just want you to kind of bear that in mind. We have some faculty partners in Colorado that surveyed over 500 behavioral health providers that serve rural communities in Colorado. The top presenting problems that they see amongst their rural clients are stress and anxiety, trauma, post-traumatic stress, and really PTSD and trauma-related disorders are very much connected to anxiety. It operates, for the sake of simplicity, relatively along the same circuits in the brain. So if we look at stress and anxiety and trauma as 2 of the top presenting problems there, it gives us a pretty good indication of why it may be important to have at least some understanding of these concepts. Number 3 is depression, 4 is addiction, 5 is family, couples, or other relational issues. In Colorado, we are one of the states across the country. There may be 18 right now. Rachel might be able to tell me exactly, because try to share and Alex try to share a list as to how many voucher programs. Colorado is one of the programs, or one of the states, that has a free voucher program that allows therapy for anyone in agriculture. We've provided to date just over 1,000 hours of free therapy for Colorado producers. And I just wanted to highlight here the presenting problems that we see amongst these ag-specific clients seeking therapy are a little bit different than what we saw in terms of rural populations in general. So the number 1 presenting problem that we see in this program, there's been 571 hours devoted to addressing marital, family, and interpersonal problems. That's pretty important to recognize, because our relationships are one of the things that are definitely impacted by stress, anxiety, trauma, things like that. So it's important to be aware of that. By contrast, 242 hours have been put towards ag stress or activities of daily living, and then 82 towards substance use specific. So I just wanted to share that, sort of give you some context for what when people are seeking help, these are some of the things they're seeking help for. If you're not familiar with Dr. Michael Roseman, he's kind of considered the godfather of agricultural psychology. He was a psychologist and farmer out of Iowa, really got to work during the 80s farm crisis when there was a massive amount of foreclosures, suicide levels were increasing. The Far Sand Network, that, the map of the country divided into 4 sections, that was actually his idea. He wanted that back in the 80s, and it almost took 40 years for it to come to fruition, but he's to credit for that as well. He came up with this term called the agrarian imperative. He says that producers have this genetic drive, like this is hardwired into their DNA, that propels them to work uncommon hours, take uncommon risks, sometimes at the cost of their physical and emotional and social well-being, all because of this really innate connection to the land and a desire to protect that land at all costs. So the agrarian imperative is an innate connection to the land that drives agricultural producers' industriousness, resilience, and determination. So it's important to understand that, because sometimes from the outside, you may question, why is someone willing to take the financial gambles and sometimes the social gambles and the impact it can have on family relationships just to maintain this lifestyle? Well, it's more than it's a calling, and it's part of their identity. And so I think it's important to recognize that. I do want to say a couple things about industriousness and industriousness and determination. The notion that is hardwired into much of the sort of rugged, individualistic value set within our agricultural producers, things like cowboy up, pull yourself up by your bootstrap, which interestingly was intended to be ironic, like you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So it was meant to point out the fallacy of that. And yet we've also adopted that as sort of a badge of honor. So many of you may have heard of this saying, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. If anyone knows where that quote comes from, feel free to jump off mute real quick and tell us. It's not Kelly Clarkson, I'll give you that too. Sometimes I hear that. But does anyone know where the original quote came from? It's from our school, from the School of Life. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. All right, we'll go ahead. And that came from this gentleman with the fabulous mustache. His name is Friedrich Nietzsche. He's a German philosopher. So what's interesting about Nietzsche, like we've all adopted this thing about what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. Like if you still have a couple appendages and your heart's still beating, you should be able to rub some dirt on it and just walk it off. The problem with this saying is that Nietzsche died around age 55. And he spent the last 10 years of his life barely able to communicate with other people and in and out of insane asylums. So while this sounds great as a way of sort of brushing off the gravity of the experiences we go through, if we understand the context of his life, a more accurate description here would be, what doesn't kill me immediately will slowly and gradually grind me down to where I lose all my relationships, my sanity, my health, and cause me to die early. That's probably the most accurate reflection of this. Now, that doesn't sound as good. So there are some ways to shorten that and make it more practical. And that would be this. What doesn't kill us makes us stronger if we have the internal and external resources to cope. I am stealing that from the book, The Body Keeps the Score by Basil van der Kolk. If you're not familiar with that book, it's a fantastic read. And so he says his definition of trauma is that traumatization occurs when our internal and external resources are insufficient to cope with a threat. And if we have that, we have a pretty good starting point for understanding trauma. And understanding that mitigation of trauma is really about that increasing both internal and external resources. So when we talk about coping, this is where we get to that question I mentioned before, that reframe about what's happening to me versus what's wrong with me. If I look at my stress response is, I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm constantly on red alert, it's impacting my ability to connect well with others, my social relationships are running in the red, I just don't have enough fuel or time to give to other people, my sleep's impacted, all those things, it's really easy to look at this as some sort of moral shortcoming or like I'm damaged goods, I'm broken, there's something wrong with me. But if we can normalize this and understand that we all utilize the same operating system between our ears. And there are both pros and cons to the way this has evolved to work for us, specifically in terms of dealing with crisis. So if we can change our perspective when we're working with other people, instead of what's wrong with this to what's happening to this person, it makes us, one, be genuinely curious and hopefully humble enough to be able to really engage in an empathetic way with other people. So I want to spend a little bit of time going through a quick 101 on the psychobiology of stress and trauma and how surviving can stop us from thriving. This is based off another researcher named Dr. Bruce Perry. Dr. Bruce Perry spent a lot of time researching the impact of trauma on the developing brains of infants and children. And so also a really fascinating researcher, and there's YouTube videos on his stuff. He's also written some books as well. And so this is a little bit of a simplification, but it should give us a little bit of an understanding about our physiological responses. So one thing to be aware of is that the brain operates in complexity from the bottom up. The higher you go up the brain, the more complex it is. And the bottom parts of the brain are what develops early. So understand that as we go through this. The brain stem is what really controls all of our autopilot functions, our sleep, blood pressure, breathing, heart rate, body temperature, things like that. The next part, the midbrain, this is sometimes called the diencephalon or the lizard brain. This is what we share with lizards or reptiles. So this is about motor regulation, coordination, arousal, appetite, satiety. Largely, this system operates in black and white dichotomies. Either a reptile is safe or it's not. It's hot or it's not. It will adjust itself in terms of shade or sun depending on body temperature. It will pursue prey when it's hungry. But if you think about the emotional capacity of a reptile, they're not super good at financial planning and sculpting or art as far as we know. So relatively limited in terms of how they operate, but we share the same system within our brains as well. Now, moving up to the next part, this is the limbic system or the emotional center. This is what we share with most other mammals on the planet. So if you think about the emotional capacity of your dog, dogs have a strong set or a strong notion of social connection. They have a sort of pack mentality. They know where they fit in that, and they understand on a real biological level that their survival depends on that pack. They have attachment as a result. They engage in sexual behavior. They have emotional reactivity. They can express emotion. And this is another part we share. And a lot of our emotional centers are connected to this as well. And then moving up from there, this is the last part to develop, the cortex, or specifically the neocortex, which is really kind of the front center here. General consensus is this reaches development in females around 24, males around 26, because sometimes we tend to be a little bit slower on the uptake. But this is also why when you think about adolescence and decision making, they're not really good often at weighing out the pros and cons, the risk reward of their choices. Well, that's a large part of what the neocortex does, and it's not fully online or developed yet in adolescence, so it takes a while. This is the part of the brain that's responsible for abstract thought, things like our values, our morality, our spirituality, poetry, anything that you want to look at as a higher sort of cognitive complex. It's also where our best problem solving comes from. And so that's important to note. So real quick, these are sort of the main structures of the brain. This is a bit of a simplification, I understand that, but it gives you some sort of indication of like kind of these step areas. The reason this is relatively important is because our brains have evolved largely based on our experience as a species, where the vast majority of our time on this planet has been spent in small hunter-gatherer societies. So that's kind of the way the brain evolved. It evolved to help us in that setting. What's happened over the last 500 years, whatever number you want to put on it, has significantly advanced our interaction with our environment, and our brain's evolution has absolutely struggled to catch up with that. So there's limitations in this, but if we understand those sort of primitive origins, Dr. Bruce Perry calls us as a species, or describes us as a species, as slow, naked, and weak. We're not all that fast. We don't have big claws. We don't have big fangs. We don't have natural armor. So one of the things that we carry with us that's given us a bit of an evolutionary advantage is our fight or flight response. We don't possess a lot of instincts. Like if you look at most herd mammals, shortly after they're born, they're prepared to walk and move and feed and be able to travel with their herd. Humans, we take a lot longer to develop and get to any level of autonomy, and some of us maybe never do. But to just highlight this, fight or flight is designed to, it's hardwired into us, and it's meant to give us a bit of a protective and survival function. And this is kind of the way it works. Imagine that, let's see, how many of us are on this call right now? Looks like 24, pretty appropriate number for what I'm about to describe. Let's say we're all part of a small group that lives together out in the forest, or we've got a village and we're going out in the forest to hunt for a wild boar to feed our village. While we're out in the forest, I get bit by a blue snake. This blue snake is highly poisonous. It leaves me just completely curled up in a ball, unable to move. I have to rely on the kindness of you all in my group to carry me back to the village. Maybe the medicine person fixes me up, and within a couple of weeks, I'm ready to go back out and join you all back in the forest. So, okay, I'm trucking along, things are pretty good, and then out of the corner of my eye, I see a blue flower. So what happens in my brain at that moment is very much based on fight or flight. Within the split second of perceiving that cue, which I've already come to associate with potentially lethal threat, it changes the way my brain reacts to being out in that forest. The first thing that goes offline or out the window is that higher part of my thinking. So my best problem solving is the first thing that gets impacted when I'm triggered by a trauma response. The reason for this is about survival efficiency. In those moments where I'm potentially facing a life-threatening situation, there's really no place or space or energy that should be devoted to me thinking about what I've got to do 2 weeks from now, or in the future, or other abstract concepts. Now, we could say this is a limitation, and part of the reason for people that are involved in things like law enforcement, military, stuff like that, part of the reason for training is so that you can make sure that that higher part of your brain stays online, even when your heart rate increases and you get this trauma response. But let's say for the vast majority of us, if we're faced with something really threatening, our problem solving is one of the things that goes out the window. Hand-eye coordination, fine motor movements are one of the other things that's impacted with that. In the limbic system, that fires up with emotions. The functional value of that limbic system is to give us information. It's not meant to drive the bus. It's meant to inform us and allow us to make decisions based on that feedback loop. So that fires up with fear. The midbrain that controls our regulation and our movement, and again, very much operates on black and white principles, this coordinates with the brainstem. So we get an increase in heart rate, we get an increase in adrenaline, and blood pumps to my large muscle groups to help me prepare to run or fight from this thing. So all that works relatively well if my threat is something like a poisonous snake, a warring tribe, a grizzly bear, or something like that. But there are limitations to this. The main limitation is that this system was never designed to help us deal with long-term chronic stress. It was meant to help us deal with acute, short-lived threats that we could hopefully get through pretty quickly and then get to the other side of. Some of the reasoning or theory behind this is that our ancestors had to be relatively good at dealing with acute stressors during their reproductive years. As a result, they passed those abilities down to us. So from an evolutionary perspective, the fight or flight response was really only designed to get us to the age of reproduction. If we could survive to that age and to that function, we basically fulfilled most of our biological imperative. And some people categorize the brain's overall function as having three purposes. One is to survive. The second one is to reproduce. The third one is to protect your offspring. Anything beyond that is kind of seen as a bonus in terms of the evolutionary perspective of the brain. And as I mentioned, these hardwired mechanisms were meant for dealing with acute stress, not designed to help us deal with chronic stress. So for that, we need some additional internal and external resources. All this to say, if we are working with someone that is dealing with, basically the equivalent of juggling chainsaws, where they have all these variables beyond their control and they're operating from the stress response, their best problem solving is impacted. Their ability to have the level of awareness to say, you know what, I'm standing pretty good in my social relationships. I can tell that, the people in my life are on a pretty good level. They're not needing extra help. That's a pretty refined skill that is very much part of that neocortex. And so the more stress we deal with, the more that higher part of the brain gets impacted. So a couple things that are beneficial about the limitations in this system is that, as I mentioned, this develops and kind of from the ground up, and the brainstem in particular, and a little bit of the midbrain develops a lot in utero. So if you think about the primary sort of sensory feedback that goes on in utero, it's sort of two things. One is the heartbeat. And so the mother's heartbeat becomes one of the most important sort of sensory inputs that we equate with being okay. And so there's been studies done that show that when people, regardless of gender, across the world rock babies, we tend to do it about the same rate as the mother's heartbeat. If you were to give a stress ball to a child or an adolescent when they're stressed and watch them, once they get past the initial like quick squishy phase, they sort of level out to about what equals the human heart rate. Same with rocking back and forth. So what this means is we have this innate tendency to want to go back to what our brain, the lower parts of our brain, recognize as sort of self-soothing and self-regulating. Another thing that happens in utero is that sense of containment. So if you've ever had an infant child, or you've got a niece or a nephew, or you've ever seen those babies swaddled up like little burritos, and then when you unwrap them and they do this like startle thing, that's because they're used to that sense of containment. And one of the ways we can replicate that is through something called joint compression. So a lot of people, when they get stressed, they'll crack their knuckles, their jaw gets tight. All these things are sort of the lower parts of the brain's way of trying to, again, regulate. One of the best crisis or de-escalation techniques that I had working in corrections, so after there would be like fights or assaults or something like that, or someone just really spun out because they got some bad news, I would carry starbursts in my pocket, just a few of them, and give that to someone that's really not even in a place to verbally process or de-escalate, but just the amount of force it takes on the jaw to chew through a starburst, that's enough of that joint compression that by the time they got that like completely down, you could visibly see them as they're chewing start to de-escalate. So some of these things hardwired into this are just important to understand. So some of the signs of chronic and prolonged stress, again, these systems were not meant to help us deal with chronic and prolonged stress. And there's some really negative side effects that comes from the fight or flight response. The most important, which is cortisol, which is a chemical byproduct. And so cortisol has all sorts of problems or all sorts of correlations to stress-related illnesses. It takes a severe toll on our body. And so the more we are experiencing those cortisol dumps after being triggered or our stress response goes off, the more it has an impact on our health. And if you're more interested in that, you can check out something called ACEs, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences. There's been a massive study on that with a Center for Disease Control in Kaiser Permanente that looks at the higher number of ACEs or adverse childhood experiences. And there's a range of these. I think there's maybe 12 items. And these could be things like parental incarceration, any form of abuse, parental substance use, things like that. The more of those that you have, the higher your likelihood is of, much like Nietzsche, dying early and having a significant amount of stress-related illnesses. So it takes its toll. It has a cumulative impact the more we have to live in this fight or flight response. So some of the basic signs to be aware of are changes in routine and sleep disruptions. Sleep is definitely one of our really good barometers to indicate that things are going well in our biochemistry and how we're taking care of ourselves. Physical appearance can be impacted. Mood, because again, that higher part of the brain kind of goes offline. So that limbic system, the emotional center, tends to be the one driving the bus a lot. I'm speaking a little bit in absolutes. It's not quite that easy. It's not like the neocortex goes completely blank. But if there was a way to scan sort of the energy levels of what's happening, you can see there's a reduction in that best part of our problem solving. So mood, that limbic center can definitely change how we interact with the world. Our memory can be impacted. That's a big part of cognitive functioning. It can result in physical illnesses. We can see this in terms of increase in farm accidents, change in appearance or neglect of livestock. And then another barometer for how well we are doing as adults is our children. They, again, part of this sort of evolutionary survival thing, they are very much in tuned and designed to pick up on the cues of their community around them. So all those things can be important indications. Stress and substance use is also, there's a strong correlation between those two. And again, from a functional level, it makes a lot of sense. In working with a lot of people that have experienced trauma, in fact, if I'm working with someone that has spends the majority of their time on sort of an emotional roller coaster where they don't know from one moment to the next what's coming at them, the functional value of knowing that once I smoke this substance or take this pill or take this drink, that I have some level of emotional predictability for the next hour or whatever that is, that's incredibly appealing. And so it's important to look at these things from a functional standpoint. Very few of us engage in anything that could be objectively called self-destruction. I really had a problem with that when we were working in youth corrections, when people would label someone's behavior as self-destructive. We would have a youth that maybe been with us for a number of years. They're supposed to be able to leave and go back out in the community here in about a month, and they'd get in a fight right before that. And so people would say that's self-destructive. Well, it's actually kind of the brain's real strong push for predictability and consistency. It doesn't necessarily make sense from an outside perspective, but that part of the brain that seeks to make sense of it is not necessarily the one that's driving in that moment. So understanding that people could reach out for substances during this, and that's a really sort of, in some ways, a normal response to an abnormal situation, because the brain wants to have some level of predictability and regulation there. So it's just something to keep an eye out for. So if we are supporting someone that we suspect is dealing with a significant amount of crisis or adversity, we might also want to check about how they're doing with that and if they may need some additional resources. And then again, that piece about the brain's drive for predictability, from a survival standpoint, again, we are very much programmed and designed, even if we're not totally consciously aware of it, to be constantly scanning our environment for potential threats. This was perhaps more important when we were, again, out in those forest communities as small hunter-gatherer societies than it is right now when I'm sitting in my basement. But my brain still hasn't caught up to that yet. So it still does this. It scans all the time, and it tries to make predictions, and it tries to find patterns. And the chemical reward system for the brain is really interesting because it rewards us for finding patterns, but it doesn't really care that our patterns are accurate or objectively true or correct. So what this means is that if I grew up in a situation where I was severely hurt by adults during a time when I needed adults to take care of me, it changes my wiring and my blueprint for how I look at the world. And so I begin to superimpose those experiences and all my other interactions with other human beings. And so it doesn't matter that it's necessarily accurate. It doesn't matter that it can get in the way of me being able to have meaningful, helpful, supportive relationships. From that protective standpoint, that survival standpoint, it's doing what it can to shield me. And so the more we could understand this, like if you think about it from the perspective of a security guard working in the youth corrections, any youth coming into that facility is immediately facing severe loss and trauma. They have a loss of everything that's familiar to them, every social connection that they've ever had, and then they're put in this entirely foreign and sometimes hostile and aggressive environment. And so if I'm going into that environment as a youth and my experience is adults are going to hurt me, the one thing I have control over is the timing. So I might intentionally push the buttons of the guard that runs my unit, calling them everything but a God-fearing citizen, to try to ensure that they're going to get provoked and lash out at me, because I believe that's what's going to happen. So the one thing I get to control in this is the timing. What's worse is waiting for that reaction when I don't know. So I would rather push it, have this sort of behavioral explosion, and know that I control the timing. So allowing people to understand this as a sort of normal protective response. This has nothing to do with me if I'm the security guard on the receiving end. Whatever creative names this adolescent has just called me, they didn't think of it special for me, most likely. So the more I can not personalize this and understand that if someone's in this state and acting from a heightened sense, maybe they're cussing more, they're angry, they're upset, this isn't personal. And so the whole key to crisis de-escalation is if someone's up here, my task is to get here in terms of body language, tone of voice, everything else. And that sort of slowly ratchets them down. So it's important that I control what I'm doing. That made me remember real quick too. One of the other very important parts of that brain structure, and one of the very important ways to help pump the brakes in that fight or flight response system, is breathing. Most of you have probably heard of box breathing, and sometimes this can get overused and sort of trite and repetitive, but it's actually super efficient and effective, because if we control our breathing, we control our heart rate. And that means those two connections alone can help pump the brakes in that fight or flight response. If I can genuinely breathe and do that, and allows that higher part of the brain to sort of come more fully back online. So that's really important. One of the other illustrations of this brain and drive for predictability is something called planned continuation bias. And this has been studied in airplane pilots. So one of the tricky things for pilots facing a storm is there's a very brief window where they have to make a calculated decision. Can I land at my destination before the storm gets there? You want to do that, because if you have to reroute somewhere else, it's a tremendous amount of cost for fuel and all the logistics that go with it. So there's a very dangerous place where people have to make these calculated decisions. And it's what we find is that it's very difficult for people to change their plans, especially once the stakes start getting higher. And so, again, that's no fault of anyone's in particular, especially when that stress response kicks in. These are one of the things that just kind of, it's innate within us, so it's important to be aware of. And I think it's, if we can be aware of this planned continuation bias, particularly in producers that may have generations invested in this land, why it's hard for them to consider pivoting to something else, or why it may seem like they have sort of tunnel vision. This isn't necessarily like a limitation or a lack of creativity. It could very much be a stress response too. So part of our task becomes to really be empathetic and help someone lay out options through Socratic questions, and really trying to be as genuinely curious as we can about helping them assess pros and cons of their situation. The other good thing about the brain is neuroplasticity, which the short version of this is that from the time that we're born till we draw our last breath, our brain has the opportunity to learn. So that saying about you can't teach old dog new tricks is definitely false. I'm an old dog and I can learn stuff. It's only a matter of how much I'm willing to engage in that. And what's interesting about rewiring the brain is it takes, unlike if I were trying to increase muscle mass, the brain's a little bit unique in that I do need repetition, consistency, and a small or a moderate level of predictable stress. Same thing I would need if I'm trying to build muscle. But the unique thing about rewiring the brain is we also need caring human interaction. So if we're trying to help people learn new habits, and we can provide some support by walking along with them, encouraging them to put the time and effort into practicing it, we can allow ourselves to develop new patterns. So even if my pattern was now I'm scared out of my mind of blue snakes, I can over time learn that not everything blue is going to kill me. And it just takes a little bit of time, some caring human interaction, and it's possible. So what I want to get into in terms of allowing us a compass for how to help people with this, and this, one of the models we used in youth corrections comes from something called the sanctuary model. And it was meant to be an organizational approach to creating trauma responsive environments. You're welcome to look it up. I borrowed a lot of stuff from them, primarily the SELF model. It's an easy acronym for being able to help us key into what are some of the basics we should be aware of in helping someone deal with significant adversity. So we'll go through each of these pretty quickly, but the notion is safety, emotion, loss, and future. And these are non-linear. They're not stages we have to go through in a sequential order, but it does provide for a common language. And it's a common language that can be shared across age span or lifespans, groups, organizations, things like that. The first one is safety, and there's a couple components to this. Physical safety should be pretty obvious. Being safe in our bodies and our physical environments. That's a relatively reasonable starting point for anyone dealing with a traumatic incident or a crisis. The one that we tend to sometimes overlook is psychological safety, which is being safe in our own minds and thoughts. So being okay with asking someone in a really stressful situation, Are you having thoughts about suicide? You can't put that thought in someone's head. And this may be a little bit beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, but if you'd like more information on that, I'm more than happy to help. But we do want to make sure that people are safe in their own thoughts. Social safety is being able to be safe with others. Moral safety is being able to live true to your values. So if you think about someone, entire communities have been displaced or in refugee settings, and now they may have, there's not enough food supply to go around. Someone that would normally never steal from their neighbors may do that for the sake of providing for their family, which isn't necessarily a moral breakdown, it's a survival response. So understanding, like, it's important to look at these different aspects of safety as we're looking at someone and make sure that they have some basic foundation in each of those. Emotions, we already talked about that limbic system and how that really goes into overdrive when we're stressed. So our emotions have this tendency to be disorganized and unstable as we try to ride these waves following crisis. That's, again, a normal response to an abnormal situation. I already mentioned the brain's constantly scanning the environment and initiating pre-programmed escape plans based on fight, flight, or freeze. Most of us are not even aware that's going on, but again, it's this sort of constant process. And then the more we can help people develop a sense of emotional intelligence, which is learning and having a space to explain rather than express emotions. This was a big thing I really tried to promote with youth and families we were working with. I'm not interested in people expressing their emotion. I could stand up right now and throw the chair I'm sitting on across the room and express that I'm, discontent or angry or whatever, but it doesn't solve anything. Instead, if we can help people explain their emotions, like legitimately talk through it, that's a neocortical function, so it automatically engages that higher part of the brain. So the more we can say things like, tell me more about that, walk me through that, that allows people to move into that sort of processing place where they can explain instead of express their emotion. Loss, important to understand that loss is at the heart of all trauma. And this is something, as a culture in general, we're not very good at dealing with loss and grief. And so to understand, and so sometimes we think of that just in terms of death or human loss or things like that, but it's really applicable to any sort of traumatic response. Even my example with the blue snake. If I'm sort of bedridden for 2 weeks while the rest of my community is out there being, productive and contributing, and I have that loss of a role and a loss of sense of meaning and a loss of sense of contribution, that's probably as serious as any of the physical symptoms that go with it too. So we can't necessarily fix those losses, but we can honor them and we can ask about them. And really, that's one of the best ways that we can give some credence to loss. The other is future. So any sense of future is really a neocortical function as well. And so if we can help maintain optimism for a better future, like one of the hallmarks of trauma is you get stuck in a particular moment. And there's some sort of like Psych 101 sort of conceptualization that if a youth, let's say, experiences a severe traumatic event at 10, there's a part of them that they say emotionally stays around that same age. I don't think it's quite that simple. But I do look at trauma as sort of rooting us in one particular moment in time, and then that shapes both how we view the past, how we live in the present, and how we anticipate the future. So anything that allows us to rise above that and have a more objective sense that just because things have been hard in the past, we're not doomed to that same sequence going forward, that can be super helpful as well. So optimism for the future allows people to try out new roles, practice new ways of relating, and it allows us to stay connected to people and activities that provide a sense of meaning and purpose. So that's a real quick idea around what the self is, but it allows us to key into these ideas around, is the person we're working with safe in those domains? Do they have a level of emotional regulation that will ensure that they don't end up hurting themselves or hurting others, or putting themselves in continued bad situations that just reinforce this process? Can we help them recognize the loss, and can we help them with a level of hope prepare for something in the future that might be better? It's worth noting how important play is as a way of mitigating the impacts of stress. So the $5 word for this is multisensory pattern repetitive movement. This also comes from Dr. Bruce Perry. That's a mouthful, but what it means is any activities we can do that involve multiple senses, have a pattern and repetition to them, that gets all those different levels of the brain coordinated, acting together, because part of the trauma response is those things get disjointed and they each sort of take on their own task. They're not working in harmony. So if you think about a hobby or activity, whether that's dancing, knitting, fishing, playing a musical instrument, any of those things allow us, hopefully, if we can get into that sort of flow zone where you're not worrying about what you didn't get done yesterday or what you've got to do tomorrow, where you can be fully present, experiencing yourself from different sensory perceptions, that is one of the best ways that we can help. Particularly for youth that have gone through a lot of trauma early on, they just simply don't have the processing ability to describe what their bodies have gone through. But if we can help the brain work on these different levels to heal itself and to get back into some level of rhythm with itself, that's one of the best ways we can help. So engaging in stimulating hobbies or interests that require people to learn new skills, that's about that neuroplasticity piece as well. Play allows us to alleviate stress and generate joy as we get lost in activity without stakes. So if you ever needed an endorsement to lean into your hobby, invest a little bit in doing something to take care of yourself, it's inherently helpful for your brains in dealing with stress. So what we're overall trying to promote is resiliency. Some basic definitions for that: it's a process of successfully adapting to difficult or challenging life experiences, especially through mental, emotional, and behavioral flexibility and adjustment to external and internal demands. Resilience is a term that's used a lot in terms of farm stress work, but there's a reason for it because it's also very much relevant to crop and herd health as well. You want resilient crops, you want resilient herds. And so it's a concept that hopefully we can link in for people that have those experiences and value that particular construct. So there's a few things that factor how well people can adapt to adversities. One of these is the ways in which the individual views and engages with the world. We don't have control over what the world throws at us, but we can control how we think about it. The simplified version of this in cognitive behavioral therapy is A plus B equals C. A is the activating event, whatever life gives us. We don't have control over that. B is our belief. We can control B, and then that determines C, which is our consequence, whether that's physical, emotional, social. So if we can help people take a constructive but yet optimistic view of what the world's doing and where they fit into it, that can help establish some better consequences. And we can teach specific coping strategies. I mentioned these a little bit, but the last part of this I really want to hone in on is the availability and quality of social resources. So I mentioned Dr. Bruce Perry described us as slow, naked, and weak. We're not all that fast, but fight or flight helps us a little bit. But the main evolutionary advantage we have has always been our small sense of community. Again, think about the time we've spent in small hunter-gatherer societies. That's how we've survived. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. But one of the things I want to share here is the interpersonal theory of suicide. I don't mean to get too dark with this, but I believe in the application of the strength-based part of this. So in my work as a clinician, I've probably done thousands of suicide assessments. Most of them were based on this model. And it looks at two of the biggest risk factors are, in terms of cognitions, is a sense of being alone and a sense of being a burden to others. So the value in this is that conversely, anything we can do to promote a sense of connecting with others and valuing them, to contrast that sense of being alone and being a burden, helps to create a safety net. It doesn't prevent every problem, but the more we can be attuned to that and just look at in our interactions with others, how can we convey that we value them and we connect with them? So in terms of this, the importance of this protective factor, think about this time we've been on as a species on this planet. It is our small communities, those hunter-gatherers, now our neighborhoods, now our family structures, whatever it may be. It's those groups that has allowed us as a species to endure and get past and get through every level of challenge we have ever faced, from wars, famines, droughts, whatever that may be. It's also how we celebrate and give meaning and purpose to the positive things. It's through the sharing with others that we can honor births and marriages and harvests and those things. We are inherently social creatures, and it is those social relationships that have always been the thing that has given us our most important protective factor. So while we're looking at those other pieces, the brain response, self, all those other things, the more we can help people connect in a meaningful way to others, that's our biggest bang for the buck. Conversely, we also need to be aware that it's our closest social relationships that we often sort of push away from or have the hardest time reinvesting in when we're in that stress response. And so we just want to help people make sure that they're not pulling away from those important relationships. We can help encourage people to look out when they need to reach out for professional support. We've already talked about what are some of the signs of chronic stress. And really, I'm not a big believer in sharing a ton of lists of symptoms because they're really individual and varied for individuals. But if this gives you some idea about what to look out for, it's again, largely changes in those patterns or behavior that begins to interfere with work, relationships, or activities of daily living. That can be increased outbursts of anger, prolonged feelings of hopelessness, deterioration, difficulty concentrating, increased use of substance use, or other repeated patterns of maladaptive behavior, and avoidance and social withdrawal. So some resources in terms of helping people find providers. You can go on Psychology Today and do a therapist locator based on areas if you need that. You are also welcome to reach out to me, and because I do this quite a bit for people around the country. And so if you need some help trying to navigate that stuff out, happy to help you with that. If you have a state that has an ag voucher program, and if you don't know that, reach out to me and we'll help you determine whether you do or not. That's a fantastic resource because in Colorado, we can get people connected in a matter of days, as opposed to the months it can sometimes take to get people in through their insurance networks. And then the AgriSafe network, which is also a ton of great information, has a mental health provider directory for anyone that's gone through their farm response program. So those are all relatively decent resources to hold on to. Worst comes to worst, or I shouldn't even say it that way. Another great resource, that's a better way of saying it, is 988. In fact, I would encourage people outside of crisis, if you're driving home or you're driving somewhere, you got a little bit of time to kill, call 988 and say, hey, we were in this training and the facilitator just encouraged us to call 988 and just sort of ask, what happens if I'm with someone in a crisis situation? I'll remind you all that 988 operators are paid to be there and to answer the phone. That's what they're there for, and that's what they want to do. So we should encourage them and allow them to do their jobs. So you don't have to be in crisis to call them. You can call out of curiosity to check out that process. You can have someone that's not facing a life-threatening serious emergency and still call 988 and see what resources they have. 211 is another great option for just practical resources. In Colorado, again, we have the Ag Voucher Program. If your state has one, it's worth knowing that contact information. And then can't say enough about Farm Aid, fantastic resource, everything from their call operators to the online resources, amazing. AgriStress helpline. They're a bit limited in terms of which states they operate from, and it's not as easy to remember as 988, so I definitely encourage people to program that into their phone. They have all the same services. Their call operators are trained in all the same services, have access to all the same resources as 988 operators, but also have the additional layer of understanding and being trained to work with people in agriculture. And that's that. That was a real quick crash course on trauma responsive stuff. So we've got a few minutes. I know there's a survey as well, but I'd love to open it up to questions. And if this was like an absolute light speed tour for you and you've got a bit, you want to check into it a little bit more, I encourage you to jump on the office hours tomorrow and we can talk about that.
Chad, there is one question in the chat. It says, curious if you have recommendations for, I guess, for folks who don't think of therapy as a solution, like conversation prompts, intermediate options for therapy.
Yeah, that's a really good point because therapy is not the answer for everyone. And so things like, community skill trainings like COMET or QPR, some of those things are really meant to increase community members' ability to recognize and respond to signs of behavioral distress. And I think that's a very feasible way of helping rural communities support each other. And so I think for those situations, it's more about asking, who would be someone that you feel comfortable talking about this? Who would be someone that you can share this with without judgment? That's not going to think less of you or talk behind your back. Who is someone that would be a good sounding board? Who's someone that's maybe gone through similar things like that? So being able to ask those questions where you connect them back into hopefully their own inherent sort of social resources that they may have. And sometimes, again, when we get really stressed, we're not good at doing a self-evaluation of what our resources and assets are. So sometimes it can be something as simple as questioning that way to get people to connect to it. See if there's other questions. Some other prompts in terms of people that aren't looking for therapy is, again, if we keep that sort of self model in mind, just asking how people are feeling, having them rate that on a scale of 1 to 10, having them keep track of that. A lot of, this isn't the best example, but a lot of farmers will keep a little spiral notebook in the shirt of their, or in the pocket of their Pearl Snap shirts like this one. And so I really encourage producers to become their own best sources of objective measurement and observation. So if someone that I'm working with is experiencing high levels of stress or panic attacks, I want them to keep track of what's triggering that. On a scale of 1 to 10, how severe was it? Because ultimately, over time, we want to know whether that frequency, intensity, and duration decreases. And so one of the best ways for producers, or anyone really for that matter, to know whether they are effectively managing these things is for them to keep track. And so asking people to record their emotions is one way. Again, asking questions that help them develop that future orientation towards future goals and checking back in with them. So we're reinforcing that. All those things can kind of help.
And someone else said, where can I find which states participate in the vouchers?
Kelsey, I'm going to drop my email in the chat, and you're welcome to reach out to me. I can try to get you. Or actually, Kelsey, what state are you in? Or are you trying to look at a whole range of things? That's fine too. But I'll drop my email in there, and you can reach out to me. North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia. I think there's some in a few of those, maybe. Rachel, I saw you nod your head. Do you have a more immediate access to information?
I know North Carolina, but I can, do more research on the rest.
Yeah, I'm happy to too. So here's my email address. Feel free to reach out to me and we can check that stuff out. So.
Thank you so much, Chad, for taking the time and sharing your knowledge and wisdom. I think that these skills and this information is going to really come in handy for folks as they're working with farmers in crisis. So just thank you for being here, and thanks everybody for joining. I think we can close it out, but yeah, we'll send out the recording and the slides, and definitely feel free to register for the office hours tomorrow, and please do the feedback survey so that we can keep having more awesome trainings for y'all.
And Mary, are you going to send that survey with the email?
Yeah, I can send it out over the email.
Okay.
I did put it in the chat, but I can send it out again.
Gotcha. Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you all so much for what you're doing. Our rural communities, the best resources are those human resources. And so everything you're doing to provide support and connection, that inherently in and of itself is valuable, in addition to the amazing sort of content and expertise that y'all, content matter, subject matter experts that y'all bring to things. So it's fantastic. Honored to be a part of even helping in any small way that I can. So thank you all for what you're doing to help our producers in our rural communities.